Hello again and welcome to another video. This thing here is an ASUS G20AJ. It's a gaming PC that will soon be 10 years old. I got this example from Facebook Marketplace almost for free because it was missing many of its parts. And because those parts were not standard, I couldn't acquire any spares. That led to me having to basically completely redesign the cooling system of this PC. So it turned out to be quite a bit more work than I thought, but it's now been in almost daily gaming use for over a month now. So for now all the mods I made to it seem to be working pretty solid, so I'm very happy about that. So let's go over all those modifications I had to make, and let's start from the disassembly of this PC. The side panel is secured on by two different screws. The upper one needs to be revealed by taking off this plastic piece. After that, the side panel slides off. The side panel is connected to the motherboard with two cables because it has red LEDs in it. Now, if you've had the absolute pleasure of working with one of these things before, you'll immediately notice that this is not at all how this is supposed to look like inside. Let's focus on the disassembly for now. So there's three screws holding down the graphics card carrier thingy, and there's also three screws holding the red plastic piece in the back. After all those screws have been removed, this plastic piece can be removed, after which the GPU holder tray thing can be removed. The GPU might also be connected by a 6-pin or 8-pin power cable. As you can see here, I've already experimented with this quite a lot. This would originally have had an angled PCIe X16 adapter that was missing from this one, and all of those I could find on eBay were way too expensive. So I tried different X16 extenders I already had, and this one was low profile enough to fit. This PC originally had a DVD drive, but I've had to remove that since it wouldn't fit in with my Frankenstein together CPU cooling solution. Where this DVD drive used to be mounted, I now have a 240 gig SSD, which is the boot drive with Windows 11 installed. And I also have a 1TB HDD in this system for additional storage, which is mounted with a 3.5 to 2.5 inch drive adapter. This PC was also missing all of the SATA cables, both power and data cables. While the data cables are standard, the power cables are not, and this that I'm using here as a power SATA cable for both of the drives is a leftover from another project. I think it was probably from HP or Lenovo PC. While I could have got an original spare part, those were pretty expensive, and I checked the pinout. This cable that I already had happened to match, and so I used this one. Next problem was the completely missing CPU cooler. Only cooler I could find that was low profile enough and had a compatible mounting solution was this cooler from a Fujitsu PC. It's about the size of an Intel stock cooler, and it doesn't have a copper core, so its cooling potential will be very limited. It needs to be low because I'm going to install a blower style fan on top of it. The original CPU cooler would have looked like a bigger version of a laptop CPU cooler. It would have had heat pipes and two blower style fans. Some versions of this PC would have originally came with a desktop version of i7 CPU, so it needed a lot of cooling. Since this cooling solution isn't quite as robust, I need to take it into account when selecting a CPU for this PC. The easiest solution probably would have been to use an S or T variant of Intel 4th Gen CPU, since those are lower TDP variants, so they produce less heat. However, I happen to have this Intel 4570R CPU. This also has a bit lower TDP and lower clock speed than a normal i5 4570. 4570R was originally not socketed but a soldered CPU that was used in iMacs or mini PCs. However, this one has been soldered onto an adapter that can be inserted into a normal CPU socket. Because of the adapter board and the added IHS, this CPU is a bit thicker than a normal CPU, and so the socket needs to be detached and washers need to be inserted under the socket screws. This will lift up the socket and it will not apply too much pressure on the CPU. If you find this CPU interesting, I have more videos about different CPUs that also have been adapted from BGA soldered to LGA socketed CPUs. Anyway, let's continue on with this build and let's hope that this tiny little heatsink will be enough for our Intel i5-4570R CPU. As a CPU fan, I installed a blower style fan, so as well as working as a CPU fan, this fan is also an exhaust fan. This similar solution is used by many Dell Optiplex SFF PCs. I needed to adjust the size of this fan so that it would properly fit inside the case. There would probably be more clean and professional ways to do this, but I just weakened the plastic with a knife from one place and then snapped it off. Now that the fan is the correct size for the PC, the next problem is the cable or how to connect this fan to the motherboard. This problem, like the previous ones, is also caused by non-standard components. In the BIOS, it allows you to set both the CPU and the case fan to PWM mode, which gives the impression that it's a standard fan, but the connector certainly isn't standard. I tried to look for a pinout of this connector. No one was quite sure what this connector or the pinout was, but many suggested that it's probably the 4-pin VGA PWM that's also found on many graphics cards. If it was that one, it would be more convenient because the pins would be in same order as in normal PWM fan, but it's not that one. I tried and I got a smoking fan. So pinout in this is different. Also, the pins are much closer together in this one compared to the VGA PWM standard. So I had to make my own adapter. This black connector was found inside an old laptop. It was a speaker connector, but it happened to fit perfectly. I also eventually found the pinout. I found a video where somebody used a 3-pin fan in this connector, from which I could obviously also see where the 4th pin would go. Now that I knew the pinout of the 4-pin CPU fan, I could also guess the pinout of the 5-pin case fan. Pinout was the same as the CPU fan, except the case fan has one pin that doesn't connect anywhere. I wanted to make use of the case fan PWM header too, but that of course meant that I would have to hunt down a compatible connector. Now where would I find a weird non-standard 5-pin fan connector? Of course inside an iMac. The wires in the iMac connector were so thin it was very difficult to work with them, but eventually I got them soldered to the jumper wires I used to connect to the fan. In the CPU fan I extracted the metallic crimps out of the connector and soldered the jumper wires straight onto them. That turned out to be a pain because the crimps are so close in the connector. It was difficult to get them back inside the connector after soldering the wires onto them. Because of that I wanted to solder the wires onto this case fan connector in a different way. After soldering I took out the 5th wire that we won't be needing in this PC. After that I used some tape to insulate the wires from each other. And after this painstaking process, here is how the finished product looks like. Yeah, it looks like a mess, but let's hope it works. It was really difficult to get this Frankenstein together connector connected without having it completely disintegrate. But at least for now, you can see here that it's actually working. In the BIOS it does show the RPM of the fan from both the CPU and the case fan, which I think should mean that the PWM control works like it should. By the way, this PC came with 16 gigs of memory, which is quite weird since so many parts were missing. Usually memory is the first thing people harvest from these PCs. With the newly added intake fan, the side panel refused to close, which was because of these screws I used to mount the fan. This problem was solved by just bending the GPU carrier tray thing a bit. Speaking of the GPU, this RX 560 turned out to be defective, so I got a new GPU also from Facebook Marketplace. I got this Zotac 1066GB and this Gigabyte low profile 1050 for €75 combined. 10 series cards seem pretty affordable now. Anyway, I noticed that this 1066GB doesn't have any memory cooling, so I added thermal pads, although I don't know if I just made the situation worse, because the contact with the cooler is quite minimal. Okay, so final thing that needs to be done is to make the cooling work without the original fans. As you can see here in the side panel, there's 3 holes for air intake, the GPU and the case and CPU fans. All of these fans together were meant to create a negative pressure inside the side panel, which would then cause cool air to be drawn in through this tiny gap in the bottom of this case. Yes, this gap you can see here is the air intake for this PC. Without the OG fans, I can't of course test if it works or not, but at least some G20AJ owners have been complaining about overheating. I totally can see that happening. Well, if the cooling had problems when it worked like it should, in my PC that doesn't have the CPU and case fans where they should be, the problem will be worse. Because of that, I decided to make a new air intake in the side panel. I first weakened the plastic from one spot and then snapped a piece off. To cover the ugly edges, I used this thing, I don't know what it's called. Maybe the chrome color didn't turn out looking the best with the black and red PC. Maybe red or black would have worked way better with this color scheme, but at least the edges are covered somehow. Now the GPU and the intake case fans will be right here, so I don't want to leave this open. I took this piece out from a random side panel. I think that was an Acer PC, so this will really be quite a mismatch of different components. I chose to put this between the different layers of this side panel because I don't want the fans to be right against this mesh. That usually means they would be louder. This way there will be a gap between the mesh and the intake and GPU fans. After this, the side panel can finally be reassembled, making sure that the 2 LED cables are properly routed and then connecting them to the MOBO. After this, the side panel can be put back on and the PC can be reassembled. After installing Windows 11 with RUFUS on the SSD, we can power the PC on. Since the PC won't have its DVD drive, I thought about covering the hole it leaves behind, but in the end I left it like it is. Enough work with this build already. In the case that you still need a DVD drive in 2023, the easiest solution would be to buy an adapter that converts it into an external USB device. Both the intake and exhaust fans seem to be moving a lot of air, so they seem to be functioning properly. In synthetic benchmarks, it seems that this PC is performing about how you'd expect, but let's see if the weird CPU works well in games. BeamNG at 1080p and medium settings is very playable. Of course you could get more FPS by lowering the settings further. CS2 at 1080p and these settings was very playable. Here I'm playing it thinking that the Nvidia overlay is recording the FPS and other information because the overlay was visible in recordings of other games, but in CSGO recordings the overlay isn't visible at all, so no FPS. Fortnite at 1080p did work well, no need to switch to performance mode on this PC yet. I tested Elder Scrolls Online because it just happened to be free at the time, and yeah, it runs pretty well at 1080p.
Someone, we need help.